Years ago, I was writing a fantasy story, but stopped to do some research because I didn't feel like I really understood the medieval pathos. So I went to a used bookstore and I picked up a pile of books on the time period. One of those books was The Structures of Everyday Life, 15th century to 18th century, by the French historian Fernand Braudel. I only picked up that one to get some tips on implements and housewares, add a little atmosphere. I don't remember a single detail from any of the other books, but Braudel's book was life-changing. I grew up reading history, my degree's in history, but I'd never read anything like it. You see, almost every historian focuses on the chess pieces, the who, the where, the when, what happens, but not why it happens. I don't think Braudel ever used the term worldview, but that's what he was talking about. Worldviews, a conception of the world. In other words, your basic assumptions about the world and your place in it. He looked at the chess pieces and he tried to figure out why they were moving the way they were. And when I finished with that one and the other two books in that series, I began to understand not just the medieval period, but other time periods too. And so, as we get ready to jump into our series on the modern mental illness crisis and how our current worldview is causing that crisis, I wanted to do a short video demonstrating how Braudel's method looks in practice. And in honor of the man, I picked an event that affected him directly. You see, Fernand Braudel fought in World War II. Briefly, of course, since his native France didn't hold out very long. He then spent 2 years as a German POW. So the question I ask is this: why didn't the French hold out very long? If you ask most historians, they'll tell you that the French weren't prepared for the German blitzkrieg, that new way of waging war using planes, tanks, and troops all in combination. But that's not true. Now, a good military historian will tell you that it was the difference in the quality of the troops and their leaders, and that's more to the point. But it still doesn't answer the question, why? No, for that I have to start by giving you the world's shortest primer on military combat. Here it is. Up until very recently, nearly all military battles were fought in lines. It's simple biology. Our eyes face forward, so we tend to do a better job fighting our enemies when they're in front of us. This meant lines of soldiers facing off against other lines of soldiers, and it usually meant battle strategies that centered on getting around or behind enemy lines, so that you could attack them from the sides or from the rear. And if you couldn't get around, you'd just try to go through. And if that happened, and you made it straight through your opponent's lines, the opponent was almost always going to attempt a maneuver called closing the breach. They'd send whatever they could to plug the leak and keep it plugged until they could move all their lines around into a new defensive configuration. Now, because victory was so close for the attacker and disaster so close for the defender, the fighting at the point of the breach tended to be the fiercest, the bloodiest, with the highest percentage of casualties of the battle. What has got to be the most extreme example of this happened to the French back in World War I when the Germans created a breach at a place called Verdun. That time the French rushed to close it. They even took taxis from Paris because they didn't have enough trucks. What they didn't know was that it was a trap. The German strategy was just to open this breach and then to pick them off when they showed up to close it, then reopen it again and again. This went on for months. But give the French soldiers credit, they closed that breach every single time. Then, 24 years later, the Germans opened one single breach, and no one made any serious attempt to close it. And so the obvious question is, what changed? And I'm convinced the answer has to do with the changing worldview that took place from the Industrial Revolution to the outbreak of World War II. You see, up until the Industrial Revolution, the typical European, although they went to church and did all the rituals, mostly thought of their religion in terms of their anxieties. And they had a lot to be anxious about. Disease, warfare, primitive medical procedures. Life tended to pretty much stop when it got dark. It had to. Step in a hole, break your ankle, and you could be crippled for life. They used to go to church every day. Not because they had their heads in the spiritual clouds, not for most of them, but because they were scared. And Mass or service for most people was a kind of Prozac against all those anxieties. But during the Industrial Revolution, mankind got a handle on a lot of those problems. More food, better medicine, electric lights. And none of it came from church services. It came from human invention. And so, for a lot of people, religion no longer met any immediate need in their lives. And so their basic assumptions about the world and their place in the world changed quickly. Sociologists call this secularization, losing your religion. And this process was well underway when World War I broke out, but it wasn't anywhere near finished. Philip Jenkins has a good synopsis of this. At the outbreak of the First World War, a new anxiety appears, obviously, and things like church attendance suddenly spiked. But these prayers weren't answered for 4 long years, and came at the cost of millions of lives. What happened next Jenkins calls fragmentation. Worldviews that had been based on religion spread out into all sorts of ideas, many of which centered on mankind, like Marxism and fascism, or centered on the individual through the spat of hedonism that came with the Roaring Twenties. And nowhere was this hedonism more concentrated than in France. Paris earned the nickname the New Babylon. Alcoholism rose. After a sharp spike at the end of the war, marriage rates steadily declined. Live for the now, for the moment, for yourself. Oh, and then Germany attacked again. When Germany invaded in 1940, France, Belgium, and the British Expeditionary Force actually had the advantage in manpower, and even in machines. We tend to think that Germans had more of those things than they really did, because that's what people saw in the propaganda films that they released. But really, they still moved most of their equipment on horseback. Didn't matter. This time, they opened one breach.
And a play. Porcello's underneath it. Here comes the catcher, Leon. They collide and it's dropped.
What followed is one of warfare's great blame games. Who was supposed to close that breach? The other guy. Not me. Historians talk about the breakdown in communications, which is attributed to equipment and poor command structure. But there's at least one account of a headquarters where orders weren't being given at all. "30 years later, when they could finally make fun of it, the French film industry released Now Where Did the Seventh Company Get To?, what I'm sure is a hilarious send-up of the various French units that suddenly became directionally challenged after the Germans attacked and never managed to arrive anywhere useful. But it'd be hard for me to laugh at something like that. They say that strong men make good times make weak men, and weak men make hard times. Or, as the French author and philosopher Voltaire put it, history is filled with the sound of silken slippers going downstairs and wooden shoes going up. Why did the French surrender so quickly in World War II? Because too many of them took off their wooden shoes after World War I and put on their silken slippers. I'm not judging here. I live in a country that just crashed its own government server, looking up ways to avoid the draft because they were afraid of going to war with Iran. But make no mistake, at the point that France folded, the death toll from World War II outside of China was still in the thousands. Stunned and emboldened by this success, Hitler would go on to bomb England, invade the Soviet Union, and the Nazis would attempt to genocide an entire race. The fire bombings, Hiroshima. 57 million people died closing that breach. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.